I want to start by saying that I love Christmas. I really do. I don't know about yourself, whether you're someone who loves it or loathes it or just puts up with it. But I love Christmas, and I think it's fair to say that families have all kinds of different traditions and rituals, and even some rules perhaps around Christmas. Maybe some of you on Christmas Day will open your presents as soon as you wake up. Maybe others have to wait until after you've had your lunch. Different families do different things, and I think we've some Polish families, and they even open their presents on Christmas Eve, the night before. Yeah, so there's different ideas around Christmas. Maybe even about decorations, about the food that you eat, or the presents that you give and receive. And the reason, I guess the aim for all of us is that we all try to make Christmas nice. We want it to be nice for ourselves and for our loved ones. But although we make it nice, I think we have to admit that it's never perfect. It's not like the adverts, the commercials on TV, which look so, everything just looks larger than life. The Brussels sprouts are greener than the ones that you get or whatever. Everything looks so perfect. Our own efforts at Christmas, there'll always be something goes wrong. The peas get left in the microwave and you find them the next day, or whatever it happens to be. I think, though, for some families, sadly, it's more like the soaps on TV than the adverts. Normally every year, whether it's, Hollyoaks or EastEnders, whatever it happens to be, there's always drama in the Christmas episodes. Something gets blown up or whatever, and there's normally some kind of tension or family strife. Sadly, some homes will be like that this year at Christmas time. But I guess over all of that, our hope is that everything will come together, that all of the normal challenges, the normal sorrows of the other 364 days of the year, that somehow those challenges and sorrows will evaporate in some kind of Christmas miracle. But I think we're all wise enough to know that that's not going to happen. The TV adverts, the commercials are not real. This Christmas, just like any other Christmas, it might be great fun, it might be a lot of laughter and a lot of love, but it will not be perfect. Not in the way that we see it on the TV commercials. But if we're Christian people, I think we can love Christmas more than anyone else. And we can do that because we realize that it is the reason. Christmas is the reason that everything one day really will be perfect. It really will. We can look forward to something far better than the TV adverts promise. And not just for a few days in December, but every day. You see, the first Christmas offers something far better than the TV adverts. Even after the wrapping paper has been recycled and the decorations are off the tree and back in the attic, that first Christmas offers peace and joy that lasts forever. It lasts into January, February, and the whole year through. That's what the first Christmas offers. So whatever's happening in your life right now, the events of that first Christmas speak directly into your circumstances. They speak into your life and they offer hope. But if we're not careful, Christmas becomes shopping and cooking and gift wrapping and stress and indigestion and all of those things. What we need to do, though, is to stop and to think about what the Bible's account of the first Christmas teaches and tells us about God. Truths which should refocus our hearts and remind us of who God is. Remind us about what God's like and what He's doing in this world, including your life and mine. And so this year in our Christmas services, as I mentioned earlier on, we're loosely following this little book called An Even Better Christmas. It's by a guy called Matt Chandler. I'll share a few quotations from him at various times as well. And what we're going to discover is that we can have an even better Christmas. We can have the best Christmas by celebrating not only that Jesus has come, but also that he's still at work in this world today. And he will return, not as a baby, but as a ruling, restoring king. And so Christmas is about more than celebrating Jesus' birth, although that's undoubtedly part of it. No, Christmas is also a powerful reminder of the fact that God gets involved. God gets involved, he gives joy, and he is worth trusting. Those are the three themes that we're going to be thinking about this year in our Christmas services. That God gets involved, that God gives joy, and that he's worth trusting. And so Christmas is not just one day, and it's not even just a season. No, Christmas, if we truly understand it, Christmas changes everything. So today we're looking at the first theme, which is that Christmas reminds us that God gets involved. That's our title up on the screen behind me. That's our title for today. I think all of you probably realize, and some of you have experienced it for yourselves, that preparing for a baby takes a lot of effort. There's a lot of preparation goes into that has to happen before a baby comes along. Now the same was true for Jesus' birth, and I don't just mean for Mary and for Joseph. No, Jesus' birth was thousands of years in the planning. In fact, the whole of the Old Testament tells us about the preparations that went into Jesus' arrival that first Christmas. And in fact, in a sense, the Old Testament is like the introduction before Jesus arrives. The Old Testament is full of glimpses pointing forward to what was going to happen. And we're going to look at just one of those, one episode from the Old Testament, something that happened about 1,400 years before Jesus entered this world as a baby. Matt Chandler, in his book, he gives the heading to this section. He calls it Welcome to the Mess. And I thought it was a good title, so that's the one that we're going to use today as well. So Welcome to the Mess. In 1400 BC, God's people, we call them the Israelites, or sometimes we call them the Hebrews. At that time, they were more often called the Hebrews. In 1400 BC, God's people were in Egypt. They were suffering as slaves under the rule of the Pharaoh. Now, you might think there's nothing unusual about that. Slavery and oppression was and still is common. However, God's people, the Israelites, had been promised by God that they were his chosen people. And as his chosen people, God had promised them that they would become a great nation, that God would give to them a land of their own, that God would bless them, and that through them, ultimately the whole world would be blessed. But instead, they found themselves as slaves, and not even in their own land. And it got worse, because you see, the Hebrew people were growing in numbers, and because of that, the Egyptians, they feared an uprising. And so Pharaoh decided that all of the baby boys must die. First of all, he tried to do that by telling the Hebrew midwives that they must kill the baby boys when they're born, but, well, they didn't do that. That didn't happen. And when that didn't work, Pharaoh commanded the Egyptian people themselves that they must throw every Hebrew baby boy into the River Nile. So God's people were being oppressed. They were struggling. They were being mistreated. And I think if you and I had been there, we would have shared in their sense that there was no future for them. Now, maybe in some way that's how you feel at times. You feel unfairly treated. Maybe you feel upset at what's happening in life. Perhaps this Christmas you're struggling, and maybe you even feel like hope is fading at times. Maybe that's because of what others have done. Maybe that's because of regrets you have about your own actions or choices. Or just because life is not going the way that you had imagined it would or had hoped for. And that's why we're starting this Christmas series where we are here in Exodus chapter 1. We're starting it here in this time of struggle, in this time of suffering, when God's people probably felt abandoned and God seemed absent, and his promises probably seemed like fantasy, like fairy tales. You see, even at Christmas, whenever we look out at the world around us, we quickly realize that this world is in a mess. And if we're honest, there's parts of our own lives which are a mess too. For each of us, as we look back over the year that's drawing to an end, and we look back over 2021, this year, I'm sure, has had pain and sadness and frustration and failures mixed in along with the successes and the joys. And so that's the backdrop to Christmas that each one of us will be having this year. And so the question might be, does God really care? And can he actually help? Now, if we return to God's people in Egypt in this episode here in Exodus chapter 1, we're told that they cried out in their suffering. They cried out to God, and God heard. God heard. Now, we could read over words like that very quickly without realizing the significance. But when we pause, we realize that that's an amazing truth, that God heard their cries. In fact, more than that, he already knew all about their struggles. And today the same is true. God hears and God knows. He knows what's going on in your heart. He knows what's happening in your life. He knows the struggles you might have with some friendships or in family or in the workplace. He knows everything about every one of us. And there's nothing ever happens which is a shock to him, that he's never puzzled about what to do. And best of all, God gets involved. For those Israelites, for the Hebrew people in Egypt, God sends Moses into at that time whenever the Hebrew baby boys were being drowned in the River Nile. And I'm sure you all know the story from Exodus chapter 1, how Moses' mum puts him in the basket and puts him on the river, and he's found by the Pharaoh's daughter, which is, when you think about it, it's just so ironic that the ruler who's trying to have these baby boys destroyed, have them killed, that his own daughter finds Moses and brings him to the palace, which is where he is brought up. And when he's grown up, the Bible tells us that he sees an Egyptian mistreating one of his own people, the Hebrews. And Moses lashes out, and Moses kills that Egyptian. Now, Pharaoh ultimately finds out about that, and Moses has to flee to the mountains. And that's when God starts to turn things around. That's the whole episode with the burning bush, this bush that's on fire but not being consumed. And it's at that bush that the Lord promises to rescue his people. And so he sends Moses back to Pharaoh. Now, Moses was afraid. He says to God, I'm no speaker. I'm a poor speaker. But God says, I'll be with you. In fact, he even agrees to let Moses bring his brother Aaron with him. And so Moses returns to Egypt. He goes to the Pharaoh with this message from God, let my people go. But Pharaoh refuses. Pharaoh thinks that he's a god. In fact, Pharaoh thinks that he's a more powerful God than the God of the Hebrew people. And God gets involved. He sends the plagues, all 10 of them. There's the water that turns to blood. There's the frogs that are everywhere. There's the gnats, the flies, the animals all die. There's boils on the people's skin. There's hailstones that caused loss of life as well. There's locusts that devour everything. There's darkness everywhere, apart from in the land of Goshen where God's people were living. And then comes the death of the firstborn in every home. God did all of those things. And by doing so, he was proving that he is real, that he's powerful, that he has authority, and that he's the one who has control over everyone and everything. Now, if we were to follow that story in detail, we'd hear how Pharaoh says yes, and then no, and then yes, and then no, and he agrees and changes his mind over and over and over again, until finally, after the death of the firstborn son in every home, he finally agrees to let Israel go. But then he changes his mind and he sends his army after them to bring them back. And so God intervenes again, this time at the Red Sea. And God protects his people and destroys the army of the Egyptians. That's when God opens the Red Sea and God's own people pass through on dry land. And then he brings the sea back in on top of the Egyptian army. In his book, Matt Chandler, he points out that I think it's easy for us. It's easy for us to judge Pharaoh, and we might think, well, I would have realized after the first or the second plague that it was time to let God have his way. But what we need to realize is that we're actually no better than the Pharaoh, because every one of us, we dig our heels in too. We resist God's commands over and over again. Now maybe you're thinking, all of what you've been talking about, Mark, all of that was back then. God doesn't do that kind of thing today. Maybe you're happy to accept that God knows what's happening. Maybe you're happy to accept that God hears your prayers. But the whole idea of God getting involved, the whole notion of God intervening, that just seems unbelievable. Especially whenever you think of the brokenness of this world, or when you think of the brokenness in your own life. You can't even imagine God getting involved. Maybe you say to yourself, that's not been my experience. That's not what's ever happened in my life so far. Even though you're coming to church, you think to yourself, well, I still struggle. And there's parts of my life that are still a mess. Maybe that's something you can identify with. Maybe sometimes you wonder, where is God? The God that I read about in the Bible. Why hasn't he turned up? Why hasn't he shown up for me in the mess that I find myself in sometimes? Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's good to wrestle with thoughts like that. It's painful, it's not pleasant, but it's good, because God wants us to be real with him. Because that's whenever we discover that he really is there, and he really is involved in our lives, and he has been all along in countless surprising, miraculous ways. Whenever we stop and look back on life, whenever we think honestly, you'll see God. You'll see that God was at work. Maybe it didn't seem like much at the time, but it made a massive difference. Now, for me, I can think of examples. I can think of when I was in the boys' brigade, there were older lads, and it was their godly example that showed me that having a ticket to heaven wasn't enough, that I needed to get involved in Christian service. And I quickly became involved in helping, even though I was only a teenager, helping with kids' clubs for younger children, so they would hear the good news of God as well. And then I can think of when my cousin Linda invited me to a holiday camp in Red Cross in an organisation called Crosslinks, and then over the next number of years getting involved in Crosslinks, that's when I really fell in love with the Bible and with the God of the Bible, realising this story that goes right from Genesis to Revelation. Some of the leaders at those camps, and even some of the books that they recommended, all insignificant little things at the time, but God was using it little by little. He had his hand on my life, and I'm sure the same is true for you. I guarantee the same is true in your life as well. There's dozens of times, maybe hundreds if not thousands of times, that God has been intervening. Too many things, too many times to be coincidences. God is intervening. We don't notice it at the time. We don't even always notice it when we look back. But when we really stop and think, I think it's undeniable that God is involved. Yes, the Lord can and sometimes does do amazing, miraculous things. But please don't overlook the hundreds and thousands of little miracles which are happening each and every day. Today we live in a society which ignores God, a society which looks for satisfaction in stuff and prefers the empty promises of TV adverts over what God offers through sending his Son that first Christmas. And as we've seen by thinking about this example of Moses and the Exodus, God has repeatedly shown that he knows and he hears and he gets involved in this messy world. He gets involved to change things. That's the God of the Bible. And the greatest example of all of God getting involved in the mess of this world is undoubtedly the sending of his own Son, Jesus, sending him into the world that first Christmas. So in Egypt, God had intervened to protect this little baby Moses from a murderous king. And he does the same whenever Jesus was a young toddler. This is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi or wise men came from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And the story continues, tells us that after the wise men had travelled to Bethlehem, they'd presented their gifts to Jesus, and then they left for home. Then I pick up the passage then at verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for King Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. Now that's the bit of the Christmas story that very seldom ever makes it into the nativity plays. But it's a part of the story that helps to confirm for us that the Bible is not a fairy tale. It's not a fairy story. No, this is real life. This is the mess into which Jesus came. Those were dark days in Judea. The land where the Jewish people lived. These Jewish people who were descended from the Israelites, the Hebrews that we were talking about a few moments ago. Judea was under Roman rule. They were ruled over by King Herod. He was the king of that region, and he was a very cruel king. But the Lord intervened to protect a special baby. And so Herod's wicked plan, God intervened to make sure that that wicked plan to get rid of him, that plan would fail. Christmas, when you think about it, Christmas is part of another Exodus story. This time the rescuer is not Moses, but Jesus. Christmas is God responding to people's cries for help. It's God's response to us asking him to do something, to help and to bless humanity just as he had promised. But Christmas is bigger and better than the exodus from slavery in Egypt. It's a much bigger and better rescue by far. Matt Chandler in his book, he says, if the Exodus story was the rehearsal, then this Christmas was the main event. And that's what all of the Old Testament was preparing and leading and preparing for. That's what the Old Testament leads up to. But this time, not by choosing someone from among his people like Moses. No, this time God intervened by becoming a man himself. That's what the angel announced to Mary in Luke chapter 1 and part of our reading. Verse 31 and 32 say this: "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." This is the truth. That's the truth that's at the very heart of Christmas. Mary is going to be pregnant. She's going to be pregnant through the work of the Holy Spirit because the Father is sending his Son into this world, into the world that he created. And this is no ordinary baby. This is God himself getting involved. This is God with us. This is Emmanuel. So God showed up. God showed up. He came himself. And we mustn't lose sight of that. Don't lose sight of that as the days ahead get busier and more stressful. God showed up. Christmas is about God getting involved. We're going to pray. Let's do that now. Let's bow.